Welcome to Africa Geotrends, your window into Africa's power, progress, and geopolitics. Asterisk before we dive in, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the stories shaping Africa's future. Africa just crossed a line the world never expected it to cross so soon, above the atmosphere. For decades, space was a playground owned by global superpowers, the United States, Russia, China, and Europe. Satellites, data control, navigation systems, weather monitoring, military surveillance, and orbital dominance were never part of how Africa was framed in global conversations. It was seen as a launch pad, a testing ground, or a market, but never as a controller of space infrastructure. That narrative has now collapsed. In 2025, the African Union officially activated the African Space Agency, AFSA. Not a symbolic committee, not a ceremonial office, but a real institution designed to coordinate satellite programs, space data, remote sensing, and orbital strategy across 55 African nations. The significance of this moment goes far beyond rockets and scientific pride. This is about control, power, and future leverage. Whoever controls satellite systems controls communication networks, financial timing systems, GPS signals, disaster response tools, agricultural planning, and surveillance capabilities. Satellites are the invisible backbone of the modern world, and for decades Africa paid billions to access systems owned by external powers. Weather monitoring, land mapping, climate modeling, mining surveys, border security, and telecom infrastructure all depended on foreign-controlled platforms. Now Africa is positioning itself not just as a consumer of orbital technology, but as a contributor, planner, and negotiator. This means decision-making power over its own data, its own infrastructure priorities, and its own long-term technological direction. The world noticed immediately. The United States sees this as both a strategic partnership opportunity and a geopolitical balancing act. China sees it as a gateway to expand technological influence and long-term cooperation. Europe sees data collaboration potential in climate research. But Africa is no longer just reacting to global forces. It is aligning itself strategically. For the first time in modern history, African countries are not pursuing fragmented national programs alone, but coordinating on a continental level. Shared policy, shared infrastructure vision, shared data goals. This is not just technological, it is psychological. For generations, space symbolized the highest level of human progress. It was where power projected itself into the future. And now Africa has entered that arena, not with flags and symbolism, but with institution building, long-term planning, and continental coordination. What people are calling a space agency is actually a power platform. The ability to negotiate future technology deals, to control climate data, to reduce dependency, and to influence international space governance. This is not about a single rocket launch. This is about Africa placing itself inside the architecture of the next century. And the real truth is, this is only the beginning. Africa just launched its own space agency, and the implications stretch far beyond satellites and scientific prestige. This is not a cosmetic project or a public relations announcement. It is a strategic act taking place in a world where space is no longer only exploration, but a core layer of global power, economics, technology, and security. The African Space Agency exists to unify and coordinate space activities across a continent that has long been treated as fragmented in high-technology planning. Before AFSA, several African nations had individual space or satellite programs, including Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Ethiopia, and Kenya. However, these programs operated independently, often competing for limited funding and support. AFSA changes that structure by creating a centralized continental framework, allowing Africa to pool expertise, harmonize goals, share resources, and speak with a unified voice in international space forums. Modern civilization runs on invisible space systems. GPS signals guide aircraft, maritime traffic, smartphones, delivery fleets, and military operations. Financial systems rely on satellite time synchronization to process transactions. Telecommunications infrastructure depends on satellite relays to reach remote areas. Weather forecasting uses orbital data for disaster prediction. Agriculture relies on satellite imagery for crop planning. surveillance, and monitoring systems depend on Earth observation satellites. These systems form the digital skeleton of today's world. For decades, Africa operated as a client region within this infrastructure, paying for access, licensing, and data provided by foreign agencies. This situation created structural dependence, not only economically, but strategically. In times of conflict, political tension, or diplomatic pressure, access to satellite resources can be restricted or influenced. AFSA addresses this vulnerability by building continental capacity, reducing reliance on external control, and opening a pathway toward technological sovereignty. The United States immediately recognized this shift. For Washington, Africa's space coordination presents both opportunity and competition. On one hand, U.S. institutions benefit from shared climate data, joint satellite missions, and technological collaboration in communication systems. On the other hand, U.S. policymakers are aware that if Africa's space infrastructure becomes highly integrated with Chinese systems, the balance of influence shifts. China has already invested in building and launching satellites for several African countries, alongside developing ground stations and telecommunications infrastructure. For Beijing, AFSA is a strategic gateway to deepen technological partnerships across the continent. But Africa's objective through AFSA is not choosing sides. It is balancing power while protecting its own interests. In a multipolar world, the ability to collaborate with multiple powers while retaining autonomy is a form of strength. The economic dimension of AFSA is massive. The global space economy now generates hundreds of billions of dollars annually through satellite services, downstream applications, data analytics, and communications infrastructure. Africa has historically captured only a small fraction of this value. By coordinating continental space policy, Africa can grow its share of satellite manufacturing, Earth observation services, geospatial analysis, and technology startups. Local companies can emerge in satellite data processing, agriculture monitoring platforms, urban planning analytics, and smart city management. Universities are already adjusting programs to include aerospace engineering, astrophysics, and space systems design. This creates a long-term skilled workforce capable of participating in the global space value chain rather than remaining on the margins. Climate monitoring is one of the most strategic roles of Africa's space program. Africa contains some of the world's most climate-vulnerable regions, from the Sahel's desertification to coastal flooding zones and rainforest deforestation in Central Africa. With its own satellite data, African governments and institutions can monitor environmental changes independently, generate region-specific climate models, and negotiate more effectively at global climate summits. Climate finance, adaptation funding, and carbon credit systems all rely heavily on accurate data. When Africa controls more of this data, it controls a stronger bargaining position. Agriculture, the backbone of livelihoods across Africa, stands to be transformed. Satellite imagery and remote sensing technologies allow farmers to monitor soil conditions, plan irrigation, predict rainfall patterns, and reduce crop losses due to drought or floods. Many African farmers currently lack access to such advanced systems. Coordinated satellite infrastructure under AFSA could democratize this access, providing data-driven farming support across rural regions. This is not just technological advancement. It is economic empowerment and food security infrastructure. Security is another critical dimension. Border monitoring, illegal fishing detection, mineral resource surveillance, and maritime tracking require space-based observation systems. Many African countries face challenges with illegal extraction of resources, unauthorized fishing fleets in territorial waters, and cross-border security threats. With coordinated satellite capabilities, Africa can monitor its own territories more effectively, share security data regionally, and reduce dependency on foreign intelligence systems. This enhances both national security and regional stability. AFSA also transforms Africa's position in international space governance. Global rules on satellite orbits, radio frequencies, space debris, and orbital licensing are negotiated in international bodies. Historically, African nations had limited coordination and influence in these forums. With AFSA, Africa can present unified positions on critical issues such as orbital congestion, equitable spectrum allocation, and space traffic management. This matters because as space becomes more crowded, Power is not only about launching capability, but about who shapes the rules that govern orbit access. There are critics who argue that Africa has more urgent problems than space technology, pointing to healthcare, poverty, energy shortages, and education challenges. But space infrastructure directly supports these sectors. Telemedicine in remote areas relies on satellite connectivity. Rural education platforms use satellite internet links. Energy planning requires satellite data to map solar and wind resources. Water management depends on space-based mapping of watersheds and rainfall patterns. Space is not separate from development. It is an invisible layer supporting development. There is also a psychological component that cannot be ignored. Space programs symbolize progress, ambition, and global relevance. For decades, African youth saw space exploration as something distant, something belonging to other continents. AFSA changes that perception. It signals that advanced science and futuristic technology are part of Africa's story too. This inspires a new generation to pursue careers in engineering, physics, data science, and technology, creating a long-term ripple effect across education systems. Africa's geographical position also gives it strategic advantages in space operations. Being close to the equator makes satellite launches more fuel efficient. Several African countries have potential sites for launch facilities, tracking stations, and space research centers. With coordinated planning through AFSA, these geographical advantages can be systematically developed instead of remaining underutilized. Another layer of significance is negotiation power. In future trade discussions, defense cooperation agreements, and technology partnerships, Africa will be able to bring space capabilities to the table. Not only raw materials or markets, but orbital infrastructure and data participation. This changes negotiation dynamics, repositioning Africa as a stakeholder in shaping global technological systems. This is not about competing directly with NASA, SpaceX, or China's space program in the short term. It is about inserting Africa into the structural future of global systems. Power is not only measured by what you currently control, but by where you are positioned within the architecture of what is coming next. AFSA places Africa inside the architecture, not outside observing it. The establishment of AFSA also strengthens continental unity in practical terms. Instead of fragmented efforts, countries can collaborate on joint satellite missions, shared research platforms, and cross-border data infrastructure. This practical integration supports political and economic integration goals under the African Union framework. It builds connectivity not just on the ground, but above it. Over time, AFSA will likely influence how global companies engage with Africa. Instead of negotiating separately with dozens of governments for satellite access or data agreements, companies will have to consider continental-level frameworks and standards. This gives Africa leverage to negotiate better terms, protect data sovereignty, and ensure local capacity building is part of future deals. Space is also becoming commercialized at an unprecedented level. Private companies are launching mega-constellations of satellites for global internet coverage, Earth observation, and communication services. Africa, through AFSA, can better regulate how these constellations operate above its territory, how data flows are managed, and how economic benefits are shared. It can also support African private companies entering the space industry, from satellite design to software services. The creation of the African Space Agency represents a strategic pivot in how Africa sees its role in global systems. It is a move away from being primarily a raw material provider or consumer market toward being a participant in shaping high-technology infrastructures. Data is the new oil of the digital economy. Space is where much of that data originates. By positioning itself within that layer, Africa increases its long-term strategic value. This moment will likely be studied in future geopolitical analysis as part of Africa's broader technological rise. Alongside developments in digital finance, renewable energy, artificial intelligence, and infrastructure integration, the establishment of AFSA is part of a pattern of strategic positioning. It reflects a continent increasingly aware of its collective power and potential role in a multipolar world order. The African Space Agency does not instantly solve Africa's challenges, but it redefines the playing field on which those challenges will be addressed in the future. It provides tools that cut across sectors, from climate to security, from agriculture to telecommunications, from education to disaster management. It embeds Africa more deeply into the systems that shape modern life. When future historians look back on this period, they may not focus on the exact date of AFSA's operational launch. They will focus on what it represented. A moment when Africa stopped being framed as a technological follower and began designing its own pathway in critical global systems. A moment when space, once distant and symbolic, became a strategic domain of African agency. Africa just launched its own space agency, but what truly happened is something bigger. Africa just inserted itself into the control layer of the 21st century, not on the sidelines, not as a spectator, but as a participant in the architecture of the future. And this is only the beginning. You've been watching Africa Geo Trends, where Africa's moves shape the world. If you haven't already, subscribe now and stay ahead of the next big story.